Tonight we begin with a chilling mystery that shook the city of Tallahassee, Florida, and later spread fear and disbelief far beyond its borders. A 12-year-old girl, bright, full of life, and with dreams of her own, vanished without a trace one June night in 2023. Her name was Lori Paige. For nearly 2 years, her disappearance haunted investigators, devastated her community, and tore open questions about the people she trusted most. At the center of it all was her father, Andrew Wiley, the man who reported her missing, the man who claimed his daughter left home with nothing more than a backpack, and the man whose story quickly began to unravel under the weight of suspicion. This is not just the story of a missing child. This is the story of trust betrayed, of evidence that pointed to horrifying truths, and of a community forced to confront the darkest possibilities of what might happen behind closed doors. It is a case where the line between grief and guilt blurred, and where the shocking discovery of Lori's remains raised more questions than it answered. A case that left an entire town divided and grieving, asking themselves if justice was truly served, or if the truth died along with the man accused of taking Lori's life. Lori's disappearance was first treated like any other missing child report, but whispers began to grow louder when investigators uncovered disturbing details. A father who had purchased emergency contraception shortly before his daughter vanished, a father whose explanations failed to match the evidence, and a father who, instead of being comforted by the community, became the prime suspect in the eyes of those who once trusted him. Still, for nearly 2 years, no one knew where Lori was. No one knew what had truly happened that night, and no one could give her family, friends, and classmates the answers they desperately needed. Then, in April of 2025, the silence was broken. In a wooded area of Thomas County, Georgia, about 20 miles from Lori's home, her remains were found. The search that had consumed investigators for years had finally reached its tragic end. But the discovery of her body was not closure. It was the beginning of even more pain. Andrew Wiley was arrested, charged with second-degree murder, and prosecutors revealed what many had feared all along. They believed Lori's death was connected to sexual assault, and they argued that this was the true motive behind her killing. The trial, however, never came. Just 2 months later, before prosecutors could present their case in court, Andrew Wiley was found dead in his jail cell. The medical examiner ruled his death a pulmonary embolism, but speculation ran wild. Had justice been stolen from Lori once again? Had the truth been buried along with the man accused of silencing her forever? The answers never came, and the community was left divided, forced to confront both the horror of what had happened and the mystery of what would never be known. In this episode, we will delve into the tragic and deeply unsettling case of Lori Paige, a case that reminds us how fragile safety can be, how quickly trust can shatter, and how the truth is sometimes lost in silence. And if stories like this keep you up at night, imagine how many more go unnoticed. Don't risk missing the next one. Subscribe now. Lori Paige was just 12 years old when her life was cut short, a middle school student, with a quiet smile and a reputation for kindness that made her well-liked among her peers. Friends described her as someone who loved drawing, someone who found joy in simple things like spending time outdoors and sharing secrets with her classmates. Teachers recalled a bright student with promise, the kind of child who blended innocence with determination, who could have had a future filled with opportunities. She lived in Tallahassee with her father, Andrew Wiley, who had custody of her at the time. Outwardly, they appeared to be just another family navigating the challenges of everyday life. But behind that surface, troubling questions were slowly forming. Questions that would not be fully realized until it was far too late. Andrew Wiley was, to many, an unremarkable man, someone who kept to himself and avoided the spotlight. Neighbors did not speak of loud arguments or obvious conflicts, but there was a sense of distance, a quietness, that made it difficult to really know who he was. It was this very distance that would later trouble investigators, who began to wonder what kind of father could explain his daughter's disappearance with so little urgency and with a story that seemed to shift under scrutiny. In the early days of the search, he told officers that Lori had left home overnight, taking a backpack with her, as though she had chosen to walk away from the only life she knew. But those closest to Lori rejected that idea immediately. She was just a child, they said, with no reason to run and no resources to survive. For her to vanish so completely meant something far darker had taken place. The days that followed her disappearance were filled with growing desperation. Volunteers combed the surrounding neighborhoods. Flyers with Lori's face were posted on street corners and in grocery store windows, and law enforcement launched search operations across the region. Yet nothing surfaced. It was as though Lori had vanished into thin air. As weeks turned to months, hope began to fade, and with it suspicion began to grow. It was then that investigators uncovered details that shifted the entire case. Records showed that Andrew Wiley had purchased emergency contraception shortly before Lori went missing. This discovery was more than suspicious. It was alarming. To detectives, it raised the unthinkable possibility of sexual abuse, and with that possibility, a horrifying motive for murder. But without a body, there was no definitive proof, only fragments of evidence that painted an unsettling picture. Andrew Wiley remained under scrutiny, questioned again and again, but he maintained his innocence, insisting that Lori had simply left. The absence of answers kept the community in torment. Families feared for their children, whispers of danger spread through schools, and the case became a reminder that the greatest threats are sometimes not strangers lurking in the shadows, but those within the walls of a home. For nearly 2 years, Lori's name remained on missing persons lists. Her photo, a haunting reminder of an unresolved tragedy. The people of Tallahassee clung to the faint hope that she might still be found alive, while quietly bracing for the truth they feared most. That truth came on April 5, 2025, when her remains were discovered in a wooded area of Thomas County, Georgia, just 20 miles from her home. The news confirmed the worst fears, extinguishing the last embers of hope. The child who had once brightened classrooms and playgrounds was gone, her story ending not with rescue, but with grief. The discovery set off a chain of events that brought the focus squarely back to Andrew Wiley. His phone records and location data placed him near the very spot where Lori's body was found. Combined with the earlier evidence, prosecutors moved swiftly, charging him with second-degree murder. To them, the case was clear. A father who had abused his daughter, silenced her to cover his crimes, and abandoned her in the woods as though her life meant nothing. For the community, the arrest was both a relief and a wound reopened. A moment that confirmed their worst suspicions, but also reignited their grief. Yet justice would remain elusive. Before a jury could ever hear the evidence, before Lori's voice could be represented in court, Andrew Wiley was found dead in his jail cell in June of 2025. The medical examiner called it a pulmonary embolism, a natural cause. But the timing, the abrupt end of the case, and the silence that followed left many uneasy. Some saw his death as an escape from justice, others as a convenient ending that kept deeper truths from being exposed. In the end, the man accused of taking Lori's life carried many answers with him to the grave, leaving behind a family shattered, a community divided, and a case that will forever linger in unanswered questions. When Lori's remains were discovered in April of 2025, investigators knew they were standing at a critical turning point. The case that had lingered unresolved for almost 2 years suddenly shifted into a full-scale homicide investigation. The wooded area in Thomas County, Georgia, where her body was found, was secluded and difficult to access, a place hidden from plain sight. It was not the kind of location a child would stumble upon by accident, and that realization alone pointed toward deliberate concealment. The crime scene team carefully searched the area, documenting every scrap of evidence. Bones, soil samples, and deteriorated clothing fragments were recovered, each piece carrying the possibility of unlocking what had truly happened to Lori Paige on the night she vanished. The investigation intensified as forensic scientists worked tirelessly to extract answers. The remains were positively identified through DNA testing, confirming beyond doubt that Lori had been found. Investigators immediately turned their focus back to the man who had been under suspicion from the beginning, her father, Andrew Wiley. Over the months of searching, his behavior had remained unsettling. Detectives noted inconsistencies in his statements and his lack of visible grief when speaking about Lori. Now, with her remains finally located, the weight of circumstantial evidence pressed down harder than ever. Prosecutors began piecing together the case they had long suspected but could not prove. They connected Wiley's purchase of emergency contraception to the timeline of Lori's disappearance, painting a disturbing picture of motive. They examined his cell phone records, which revealed location data placing him near the wooded area in Georgia, where Lori's body was later discovered. The digital trail provided prosecutors with the kind of hard evidence that had previously been missing, evidence that tied Wiley directly to the crime. The combination of forensic science and technology began to form a narrative too strong to ignore. As the case grew, so did the emotions within the community. Lori's school held vigils, classmates and teachers expressing the sorrow of knowing that her desk would forever remain empty. Parents tightened their grip on their children, fearful of the possibility that danger could be so close, hidden within the very people they trusted. The media picked up the story with relentless intensity, broadcasting updates that kept the case in the public eye. Every new revelation about Andrew Wiley only deepened the sense of betrayal felt by those who had once believed he was simply a grieving father. With the evidence gathered, the state moved forward with charges. Andrew Wiley was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, the prosecution alleging that sexual assault was the underlying motive behind Lori's death. The announcement shocked the community, but it also provided a measure of validation to those who had quietly believed he was responsible all along. Investigators prepared to present their findings in court, expecting a lengthy trial that would reveal the disturbing details of what had occurred. The courtroom was set to become the stage where truth would be laid bare, and where Lori's memory could finally receive the justice she deserved. But before the trial could begin, tragedy struck again. On June 19, 2025, Andrew Wiley was found unresponsive in his jail cell. Despite medical intervention, he was pronounced dead, with the official cause listed as a pulmonary embolism. The abruptness of his death sent shockwaves through the community. To some, it was a cruel twist of fate, justice stolen before it could be delivered. To others, it was a convenient end that silenced a man who might have revealed more than anyone wanted exposed. His passing left investigators with unfinished questions, prosecutors with a case that could never be tried, and Lori's family with a grief compounded by frustration. The unanswered questions gnawed at the community. Did Wiley act alone, or was there more to the story than had been revealed? Was his death truly natural, or had someone ensured that his voice would never be heard in court? Without a trial, speculation thrived, leaving people torn between relief that Wiley could never harm again and anger that Lori's case would never see the inside of a courtroom. The investigation had reached its tragic conclusion, but it was one that left no sense of closure. Lori's body had been found, her father charged, and yet with his death, the truth seemed to vanish with him. The people of Tallahassee were left with grief, doubt, and an ache for justice that would never fully be satisfied. Lori Paige's case became not just a story of a young life lost, but a haunting reminder of how fragile the pursuit of truth can be when it is silenced too soon. The trial that the community had long anticipated never materialized, and that absence of closure became one of the most haunting elements of Lori Paige's case. After nearly 2 years of searching, the discovery of her remains, and the subsequent arrest of Andrew Wiley, many believed they were finally approaching a reckoning. The courtroom was expected to be the place where evidence would be laid bare, where a jury would hear the timeline of Lori's last moments, and where justice could begin to take form. Prosecutors had been preparing to outline a case that they claimed would show Wiley not only murdered his daughter, but did so in an attempt to conceal a crime even more disturbing. They had planned to use his purchase of emergency contraception, his suspicious behavior in the days surrounding her disappearance, and his cell phone data tying him to the wooded area where Lori was found. It was a case that seemed ready to unfold with devastating clarity. The defense, however, was preparing their own strategy. Wiley had consistently denied harming Lori, and his attorneys were expected to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that no direct forensic proof linked him to her death. They planned to challenge the credibility of the prosecution's theory and emphasize the lack of eyewitnesses, hoping to create enough doubt to weaken the case against him. The trial was shaping up to be not just a legal battle, but a public spectacle, one that would grip Tallahassee and draw national attention. Families of missing children, advocates for victims of abuse, and the broader community were preparing themselves for months of painful testimony and graphic revelations. For Lori's loved ones, it was meant to be the moment when her story would finally be heard in a court of law, where her life and the horror of her death would not be dismissed as rumor, but presented with evidence and sworn statements. For prosecutors, it was an opportunity to hold Wiley accountable in a way that left no doubt. But all of those expectations came crashing down when on June 19, 2025, just weeks before proceedings were set to begin, Andrew Wiley was found dead in his jail cell. The official report from the medical examiner listed the cause of death as a pulmonary embolism, a sudden blockage in the arteries of the lungs. It was, in medical terms, a natural cause, yet to a community already steeped in suspicion and mistrust, the explanation felt incomplete. How could a man accused of one of the most shocking crimes in recent memory die so suddenly, just as he was about to stand trial? The timing fueled endless speculation. Some believed he had taken his own life to avoid facing the jury. Others whispered about possible foul play, suggesting that someone inside the jail, or perhaps even beyond it, wanted to ensure his silence. Without an autopsy report that satisfied every doubt, the rumors spread unchecked. The absence of a trial meant that the evidence against Wiley would never be tested in open court. It meant there would be no cross-examinations, no witness testimony, and no opportunity for a jury to weigh his guilt or innocence. For Lori's family, it was devastating. They had waited through long months of uncertainty, only to be told that the case was over before it had truly begun. To some, Wiley's death felt like an escape, a way for him to avoid accountability for his actions. To others, it left a bitter taste of unfinished justice, a reminder that the system can sometimes fail even when answers seem within reach. The public was left divided. Some saw his death as a final act of cowardice, others as an unfair ending that deprived Lori of the justice she deserved. In community gatherings and online forums, people argued over what really happened, whether Wiley's guilt had been proven enough to consider the case closed, or whether the truth had been buried alongside him. The courthouse that was supposed to be filled with testimony now stood quiet, its silence echoing the questions that could never be answered. The trial that never came became a wound that refused to heal. For Lori's classmates, it meant never hearing an explanation of what had happened to their friend. For her teachers, it meant living with the unanswered question of how the system could protect children when accountability was cut short. For her community, it meant carrying the weight of suspicion and grief with no resolution. And for those closest to Lori, it meant the memory of her life was forever overshadowed by the absence of justice, a reminder that sometimes the truth, no matter how close, can slip beyond reach. In the weeks after Andrew Wiley's death, the community of Tallahassee found itself caught between grief and frustration. On one hand, there was relief that a man suspected of committing such an unthinkable act could no longer harm anyone else. On the other, there was the gnawing reality that the story had ended without resolution, leaving questions that would forever remain unanswered. The aftermath of Lori Paige's case was not marked by closure, but by lingering pain and a flood of theories that only deepened the divide among those who followed her story. For Lori's extended family, the loss was unbearable. They had spent nearly 2 years waiting, hoping for answers, then bracing themselves for the trial, where Lori's story would finally be told in full. Instead, they were met with silence. Without the chance to hear testimony, without the opportunity to confront Wiley in court, they were left with only the fragments investigators had shared. Her relatives described feeling robbed, as though justice had been stolen from them twice. First when Lori's life was taken, and again when the man accused of killing her died before ever facing a jury. At candlelight vigils, prayers were offered not only for Lori, but also for strength, as the community sought to comfort a family carrying more weight than anyone should bear. Among the public, debates grew louder. Some believed the case was solved, that Wiley's arrest, the evidence against him, and his own suspicious behavior painted the picture clearly enough. To them, his death meant the chapter had closed, even if the legal process had not. Others, however, refused to accept that explanation. The suddenness of his passing fueled speculation about foul play. Was it truly a natural pulmonary embolism, or had someone silenced him before he could speak? Some wondered if he had connections, secrets that threatened others, or information that extended beyond the narrative prosecutors had begun to construct. Without a trial, the door was open for endless theories, each one adding another layer of uncertainty to an already painful story. For the investigators who had worked tirelessly for years, the outcome was equally unsatisfying. They had followed leads, combed through evidence, traced Wiley's movements, and built what they believed was a strong case. They were ready to present it, to show the world what they had uncovered. Instead, the sudden end meant their work would remain incomplete, sealed away in files and reports that would never see the scrutiny of the courtroom. Forensic experts who had prepared to testify never had the chance to explain the significance of their findings, and prosecutors who had prepared opening arguments never had the opportunity to deliver them. It was as though the entire legal machinery had come to a halt at the very moment it was meant to spring into action. Theories about Lori's final moments only deepened the sense of unease. Some asked whether she had endured years of abuse before the night she disappeared. Others wondered if Wiley had acted in panic, fearing exposure after she threatened to speak out. A darker question loomed. Had there been others involved? People who knew more than they ever admitted? The lack of definitive answers allowed these questions to fester, creating a haunting uncertainty that no official statement could erase. In the broader community, Lori's case left scars that would not easily fade. Parents spoke of newfound fear, of the realization that danger was not always a stranger lurking in the shadows, but could exist within the very homes meant to provide safety. Schools took steps to improve awareness. Teachers trained to recognize signs of abuse that might otherwise go unnoticed. Advocacy groups pointed to Lori's story as a reminder of the vulnerabilities children face. Using her name in campaigns meant to prevent the same tragedy from happening again. Yet for all the changes and discussions, nothing could erase the void left by her absence. The aftermath of Lori Paige's case was not defined by justice served, but by a silence that carried the weight of all that was left unsaid. A community that had once held its breath for resolution was left instead with the echo of questions that could never be answered. A reminder that sometimes the truth is lost forever, and the only thing that remains is the determination to remember the life of the child at the heart of it all. The case of Lori Paige ended not with the clarity of a courtroom verdict, but with a silence that unsettled everyone who had followed her story. The reflection that followed her father's death in custody revealed more about the community itself than about the unanswered questions of the crime. People were forced to grapple with what it meant to seek justice in a situation where the truth could never be fully established. Some believed justice had already been found in the simple fact that Wiley would never walk free again. Others argued that his death left behind a hollow victory because without a trial, Lori's story was never told in the way it deserved, and the evidence that might have provided closure remained untested and largely hidden from public view. For many, the most haunting part was not only Lori's death, but the loss of her voice in the process. She had no chance to speak for herself, no opportunity to explain what she had endured, or to reveal the final moments that led to her disappearance. Her story had to be reconstructed by investigators, reporters, and community speculation. That reality left parents across Tallahassee unsettled, realizing how easily a child's voice can be silenced and how fragile safety truly is, even in the spaces that are supposed to be most secure. The case became less about one family and more about the collective fear of all families, a symbol of how quickly life can turn from ordinary to tragic. Reflection on Lori's case spread beyond her community. Advocates for children's safety used her name to emphasize the importance of early intervention and awareness. Questions were raised about the systems designed to protect children. Had there been warning signs that went unnoticed? Could intervention at an earlier stage have prevented her death? These were questions with no clear answers, but they lingered heavily in the minds of those who studied the case. Schools began hosting discussions about child safety. Teachers and counselors trained to spot behaviors that might suggest hidden abuse, and parents were urged to engage more closely in the lives of their children, to look for the smallest indications that something might be wrong. Even with these efforts, the theories surrounding Lori's death cast a long shadow. Some speculated that Wiley's death in jail had been more than coincidence, that perhaps someone had reason to silence him before he could reveal details that would shift the narrative. Others clung to the explanation that his death was medical, that nothing more sinister was at play, and that speculation only distracted from the tragedy of Lori's story. Yet speculation itself became part of the legacy of the case, a reflection of the human need to search for meaning where certainty is absent. The conclusion of Lori's case left the true crime community reflecting deeply on the limits of justice. Documentaries, articles, and discussions emphasized not only the facts, but the emptiness of an ending that offered no definitive answers. Viewers and readers alike were asked to consider what justice truly means. Is it punishment? Is it truth? Or is it the ability for a family to feel that their loved one's story has been heard? For Lori, none of these were fully realized. Her life ended in tragedy, her story fractured by silence, and her memory left in the hands of those who refused to let it fade. As this reflection continues, one thing remains clear. Lori Paige's story is a haunting reminder of how quickly safety can shatter and how easily truth can be buried alongside those who carry it. The question that lingers is not just what happened to Lori, but how many more stories like hers remain untold. How many more children are silenced before they can be heard? And if cases like this keep you awake at night, think about how many others go unnoticed, their names never spoken, their stories never told. Do not risk missing the next one. Subscribe now, because silence only protects those who should be exposed, and remembering these cases is the first step toward ensuring they are never repeated.